we were at school. Like, I was selling DVDs, went down for another interview, then got offered it, accepted. It was only really then that I was like, oh wow, I actually need to move. I need to find somewhere to live, and do I have the money for it? It hit my mental health more than I realised. And then one day I just broke down and just said, I don't want to do this. I was hating my job, to be honest. I wasn't really enjoying it at all.
From a working class upbringing in Birmingham to running his own agency, Paddy's journey into the digital world was anything but planned. Swapping law books for SEO, he carved out a career in an industry where degrees aren't the ticket to success, but opportunity and hustle are. Today, we're diving into his story, the challenges of breaking into the industry and what needs to change. Welcome to the show, Paddy. How you doing? You all right? Was that okay for an intro?
Yeah, that's all good with me. Cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Let's begin with Well, what is it that you currently do? What's your role?
Yeah, so I've actually gone through a little bit of a career change over the last 12 months or so. So up until about a year ago, I ran my own digital marketing agency. Did that for about 10 years or so, and then stepped away from that agency about a year ago, and then formally exited in summer of last year. And now I work with other agency owners and founders to really help them try and navigate running a business, particularly running an agency, which can be very, very challenging, and just really helping them hopefully stay sane and kind of keep a handle on things and get to where they want to be as an agency. And also, I have a project where I have an online course for leaders and managers, helping them become more effective, how to run teams, manage people, that kind of stuff as well, which is also targeted mostly towards agencies. So they're my two main things at the moment.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's pretty involved role then that you've got there.
Yeah, it's pretty hands-on and pretty diverse as well. I work with different agencies of different sizes, slightly different services, that kind of stuff. So it definitely keeps me nice and busy.
That's cool. That's cool. So this series is mainly about those working in creative fields from working class backgrounds and those from like lower socioeconomic backgrounds as well. So one of the first questions I always ask my guests is, how would you define working class? What is it to you? How would you define it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I guess it's different for everyone. Even though there are objective meanings, it must be different for everyone. So for me, I think 'cause my parents were working class or are working class, so my opinion and views are probably skewed quite heavily because of that. But I kind of see it as someone and kind of something that means that people who are probably working in jobs that maybe they kind of never necessarily wanted to get into, or careers that they look at building over time. They're kind of more just jobs as opposed to careers. So typically, obviously, working class means that it's typically unskilled within reason and kind of is something that isn't necessarily a long-term career. And I think for me, working class kind of means that person may have fallen into it without necessarily wanting to fall into that. They've probably been told, just get any job you can, or get a job that is secure and pays well, even if the prospects aren't amazing. So I think it's about that, really, about the type of job that it is, and but also the fact that someone may get into it even though they may have been able to do more. My dad's actually a great example. My dad, when he was at school and kind of leaving school, wanted to be an artist and wanted to draw and be creative,
Okay.
but he got told, no, go and get a proper job. So that's what he did. He went and worked in a supermarket from a young age. So I think it's partly about the jobs themselves and kind of the type of jobs they are, but also to me it means kind of the choices that someone were given or not given in some senses as well.
Yeah. No, that's quite a good succinct way of putting it. Really, I think yeah, what you've highlighted, especially where you mentioned your dad, where he was told get a proper job.
Yeah.
That's the thing now. I think because there's so many different roles and it's so varied now, and it's because it's interesting. It's because like we've known each other for years, like since secondary school, and like
Yeah.
I've always known you to be quite entrepreneurial. Like it's like there's one stage where you had your own like flower stall, and like we were quite young at the time.
Yeah, I think I was maybe 20, 21 years old. I think I just left university, and again, instead of going to get a proper job, I
Yeah,
started a florist business in Birmingham. And I think even before that, when we were at school, like I was selling DVDs,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
even going back further when I was much younger, like 11 or 12, I got reminded the other day by someone that I used to sell sweets at break time, like because I could buy them on the way into school, sell them for a profit, and then buy Mackies on the way home. Like,
Yeah.
so even then, I was trying to kind of just make money for myself. So yeah, kind of not a surprise. I guess I've now ended up where I am, even if I did have a couple of jobs and kind of a more traditional role before I got to that point.
Did would you say that's kind of partly based on, well, you touched upon it, like your dad working at a supermarket. Would you say that kind of harks from the working class roots of that, where you had this entrepreneurial spirit, or was it kind of like, all right, let's see if I can better myself. Let's see if I can go past what's kind of expected of me.
Yeah, I think that even though my mum and my dad didn't really they didn't pressure me to do things like go to uni or to be better than them or anything like that. But there was definitely the idea that they wanted me and my sister to do more than they did when they were younger. So I think there was that little bit of a push without the pressure, to be honest. Because I remember my mum in particular kind of never pressured me to go to university. It was like a bit of a last minute decision to actually go. My dad's probably pressured me a little bit because he never got the chance when he was younger, but there was still not you have to go no matter what.
Yeah,
So I very nearly didn't go because of that. So I think that they always wanted me to do, and my sister to do better, so to speak, than they did when they were younger.
mm,
But there definitely wasn't that pressure to be entrepreneurial or to get a certain type of job or the traditional stuff like become a doctor or become a lawyer. Like none of that was actually present. It was more kind of like just do better than they did. I think was the underlying message without the pressure.
so yeah, it's quite interesting because yeah, in the intro I talk about that you studied law, but then you went into SEO. How did you end up going into law and then deciding actually SEO is the way forward? What? Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird career path from doing law to setting up a florist business to then doing SEO.
Yeah.
But I think I started doing law because I think, again, when we were at school, law got introduced as an A level around the
Yeah.
same time that we were moving into A levels. And I was like, oh, that sounds pretty fun and cool. And I remember the teacher that taught it was one of the best teachers we had as well,
Mm.
maybe Mr. T
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
And so I think I did it because I liked him as a teacher and he sounded interesting. Spent a couple of years doing it at A level. I did okay at it. I think I got like a B or something like that. So I wasn't fantastic, but I did okay. And then thought, well, actually, this might be a good thing to continue. Um, and then went to Coventry to study it. And then after about a year and a half, I kind of realised I was enjoying it, but I wasn't loving it. There was like probably 7 or 8 different modules, types of law to work on. I only really enjoyed one or two of them, and it started to dawn on me that maybe as a career, this wasn't the thing I wanted to do for the rest of my life, even though kind of it was very well paid, and it still is obviously a career in law. You get worked really hard, but you get paid very well as well. I started to realise this isn't really for me. And in between lectures at university, in the university library, I started to build websites and actually work on side businesses kind of in between lectures. Because when I was younger, I was probably about 13 or 14, I'd learned how to build websites and then kind of
Yeah.
put it down for a little bit. And then I came back to it during uni. And then I was building websites, and natural progression there is what I built something. How do I actually get people to visit the website? So I
Mm.
started to learn about what was SEO. I didn't know that's what it was called, but I started to learn about what it was and started to make a little bit of money from those websites as well through advertising and affiliate marketing, that kind of stuff. And then eventually, when I left uni and after the flower business, kind of realised actually this SEO thing, there's actual companies that do this professionally, and I could get a job being paid to do the thing I was doing in my spare time. So I jumped at the chance and kind of went from there really. And that's when I was probably about 22, 23. I think I actually got a proper job in
Yeah.
SEO rather than just doing it for my own website. So a very roundabout way of falling into it. But with SEO, hardly anyone gets into it deliberately. Most people are falling into it by accident.
Okay. So yeah. So was it a kind of pure fluke that you got into? What was, yeah? What was your
Yeah,
first kind of role in SEO? How did you break into it?
fluke's probably a good word for it. So I think it's actually my mum found a job ad for an agency just outside Birmingham who were like a web
Okay.
dev and design agency, and they were hiring for what turned out to be their first SEO, and I think the job title was actually called online marketing assistant. So it covered SEO, but also Google AdWords and kind of
Yeah.
pay per click, that kind of stuff as well, which I've done a little bit of as well. So I just applied for that job and thankfully got it. I think the pay was okay, but not fantastic. I was just happy to get a job and get kind of a
Yeah.
foot on the ladder. And that was it really. I kind of just fell into it because my mum happened to spot a job and she kind of knew enough about what I was messing about with in my spare
Yeah.
time to know that this could be a good fit for me, and then just went for it and thankfully got it. And yeah, I spent a couple of years there before moving to London to work for an agency that did just SEO and nothing else. So that kind of put
Okay.
me into it even more deeply to kind of learn and to learn from others as well.
Yeah, because this is completely new territory for yourself. Did you find there was any kind of like barriers or anything like that?
To some extent, I mean, definitely, I felt it a little bit when I started to think about moving to London, because the first agency, yeah, they were in a little town outside Birmingham, so that wasn't really a big step or anything like that. Didn't feel like there was a barrier there. Um, but when I started looking at London, I didn't apply for loads of jobs, but there was, when I was researching it and looking into it, there was definitely a bit more expectation around experience and qualifications, and not
Yeah.
too many, but some did start to mention things like having a certain degree and stuff like that. Thankfully, the industry as a whole doesn't do that too much, but I do remember that being a thing with some of the larger companies at the time. So that felt like a bit of a barrier. And obviously, also upping my life and moving to London,
Yeah.
which, Birmingham to London isn't a million miles away, but it's still, I'd never lived away from Birmingham before, so that felt like a
Yeah.
big step for me as well, which probably played a bit of a part in my thinking.
Yeah. Like because you're making that step from Birmingham to London, does it? Did you ever feel like there's a level of like anxiousness and a bit of a fear factor, like financially? It's quite a big commitment, especially for your first proper role within London. Did any of that play a part?
Only after I got offered the job. So genuinely, I applied for the job, went down for London for an interview, then got offered it, accepted. It was only really then that I was like, oh wow, I actually need to move. I need to find somewhere to live, and do I have the money for it? Because genuinely, I didn't really expect to get the job, because I had applied for one of the kind of most well-known agencies that had a really good reputation and had really smart people working there who I'd
Mm.
seen speak on stage at conferences. I was like, oh, I'd love to work with them. I genuinely didn't think that I was going to get it. So when they offered it to me, I accepted, and I was like, oh, I actually need to figure out how to do this now. So that was definitely
Yeah.
quite scary. And the money, it wasn't a huge worry because thankfully I managed to share a flat with someone. And so that kind of took some of the pressure off there. But yeah, I think at the time I just went into it and didn't really think too much about it.
Because you mentioned the jobs are kind of in London, do you feel like that's sometimes a bit of a barrier? Because is it predominantly in London? Is there other areas in the UK, or is it slightly skewed to the
Yeah,
bigger cities?
it's definitely skewed towards London. So probably less so since the pandemic, but it definitely was skewed towards London when I was kind of looking to move and early in my career, where it was pretty obvious that if you wanted to really excel and also get paid really well, London was the place to be. Back then, I remember Leeds being a bit of a hub as well, and a little bit
Mm.
of Manchester, even Edinburgh as well, had a couple of big agencies. And that is still the case now. Probably not, again, as much because more companies since the pandemic are hiring remote people now. But since probably the last year or so, even post pandemic, more people are expecting you to be in the office, either full
Yeah.
time or a few days a week. So you still really need to live within a commuting distance of a big city to really try and break through and build a career, I think. So it's definitely skewed towards the bigger cities. And yeah, London's definitely a big hub. Manchester is, Leeds a little bit as well. Not so much Edinburgh as much as they used to be, but there is definitely a bit of a tech scene up there generally, and a little bit kind of in around Bristol as well. So there are definitely
Okay.
hubs around the big cities. So that might make it difficult for someone to break into those places because,
Yeah.
as you just said, some people may not kind of go into the way I did, might actually think about it a bit more
Yeah.
sensibly.
Okay. So is there like elements of like remote working with these companies now? So if there is elements of the remote working, is there like pros and cons to it? Because I know people from like working class backgrounds might not necessarily have the financial backing to be able to move to cities. But if they've got there's this hybrid or remote element to it, does that actually exist? Does it help? Would you say?
Yeah, I think that on the whole, it's probably a lot more likely to hinder than to help. And the reason for that is because obviously, even if you're not living in London and you're commuting in, say, 2 or 3 days a week, that's still expensive, right? Most people have to cover that themselves. There are companies that will cover that for you, but in my experience, they're more the exception rather than the rule. So I was actually speaking to a friend of mine just last week who's got a company based near Ipswich, and they've got a London office, and they are mandating people spending time in London in the office, but they also
Yeah.
cover travel expenses. So it's kind
Oh,
of a bit
okay.
of a better deal because, well, you've got to be in London, but you're not out of pocket because of it. But
Yeah.
that's very expensive for them. But it's the exception rather than the rule in my experience. So I think for most people, particularly working class, as you say, it could be quite prohibitive to get a job in London or a bigger city because even if you are partly remote, and you have to spend time in the office, you still got to pay for that. And the argument is, well, that's probably how it's always been, even pre-pandemic, but
Hmm.
it still makes it hard for people to commit to those kind of jobs, I think.
Yeah. So I think this kind of ties in nicely to yeah, because you managed to form your own agency, and I suppose by forming your own agency, you can kind of set parameters, and especially coming from working class, you might have the understanding of how difficult it might be for some individual. Could you tell us a little bit how you end up forming your agency and why you did that?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't say it was as big a fluke as getting into SEO, but it was a bit accidental. So I'd always had it in the back of my mind that I may want to go back to working for myself at some point, because I always had that kind of itch. But the agency that I worked for in London at the time, a company called Distilled, I loved working there. They were a great team. I loved my boss. I loved the team that I worked kind of around, and so there wasn't really any rush to leave and set up
Mm,
my own thing. So I was like, well, I'm happy as I am. I'm earning okay money. I'm happy in my job. I enjoy it. So I'm not trying to force my own kind of step to go and do
yeah,
something else. And set up on my own. So that probably delayed things longer than it may have done normally. But eventually I bumped into a friend at a conference who randomly my wife used to work for his agency previously. So she kind of introduced us. So she claims credit for me starting my own agency. But we bumped into each other at a conference in Seattle. And I remember jokingly saying to him, oh, we should do something together at some point as we're kind of walking out of a bar one night. And then a few days later, we both ended up in Vegas together because we kind of both ended up going for a few days away with our wives or partners at the time, and sat down for half an hour at the Aria Casino and managed to flesh out the whole plan in half an hour and say,
oh,
okay, here's what we're going to do, here's the kind of company we want to build, and then I flew home and handed in my notice the next week. So yeah, it happened pretty quickly. It felt quite easy because we were both from slightly different backgrounds and had different skill sets and different
yeah,
experiences. So it felt like we could meet somewhere in the middle with the agency we wanted to build. So it felt right and felt the right person to partner with. And the timing, yeah, I mean, like I said, I was happy where I was, but the timing was never ever going to be perfect or ideal. So
yeah.
it felt like as good a time as any to make that kind of a move.
Okay, so because you've already set up businesses and you've ran your own things in the past, how how big a leap was this for you? Like it's quite an established role, isn't it? SEO. It's quite a big thing to do, and yeah, how did you find that? And was it pretty straightforward, especially because you now have got someone that you're working alongside with?
Yeah, that definitely helped because I did kind of feel like I didn't want to just go out on my own and start
Mm,
an agency on my own because I enjoyed the company I worked for so much and I had a really good culture and team. I didn't want to go from that to then working on my own, 5, 6, 7 days a week because I knew I'd probably struggle with that a little bit. So the idea of doing it with someone else really appealed. And also, I was quite fortunate in that he had a small agency already of just two other people. So I was also stepping into a small team as well. So
yeah,
that definitely took the edge off and took the fear away a little bit. And also, he had a few clients and making a little bit of revenue, so that also made it a bit more secure to step into. And also, as you kind of alluded to, the SEO industry has always been quite healthy. So I'm kind
Mm.
of thinking, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll go and get a job again,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
knew that with the experience I built up at that time, I think I was about probably 8 or 9 years into the industry at that point, and I
Okay.
figured, well, yeah, I can go and get a job if I need to. Maybe the pay won't be as good, but I can pay the bills at least.
Yeah,
So that
yeah.
definitely helped take the edge off because it was and it probably still is to some extent, a quite a healthy industry for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you set up this company. Well, yeah, where did you end up setting it up and what was your decision on doing that?
Yeah, so randomly, the agency was based in Milton Keynes because that's
Mm.
where my co-founder was based with his small company at the time. I
Yeah.
was living in London. We did talk about setting up an office in London, but that would have meant him and the other team members commuting in, and also an office that would have cost 3 or 4 times maybe more what the Milton Keynes office was going to cost.
Mm.
So I ended up commuting from South London to Milton Keynes 4 or 5 days a week and doing kind of the reverse commute,
Mm.
which now I'd dread, but got on with it at the time, enjoyed it, and it was fine. But also Milton Keynes, I was a bit skeptical at the time, but actually it's a good place for business because it's only half an hour from London, 45 minutes from Birmingham in the Midlands. So, and there's a lot of companies that are based there, got their headquarters there that you wouldn't really think were there. So actually, it's a good
Yeah.
place to be, and it really helped us in the early years to keep costs down and to find good people as well.
Yeah. And because you've now set this business up and because of your background, did you ever feel like there was you had a kind of a duty based on your upbringing? You knew there were people out there, and like for yourself, for instance, you got your first job by fluke in SEO. So, did you ever feel like, oh, I've got an obligation to kind of help those? And I suppose being set in Milton Keynes, you are kind of catering for people that aren't necessarily in London.
Yeah, there was definitely. I'll admit it wasn't in my thinking from day one because, like I said, I was a bit skeptical about being in Milton Keynes. But
Yeah.
when we were there, we came across so many people who couldn't do London. They were either doing it at the moment,
Mm.
and it was very expensive. It's cost them like 5, 6, 7 grand a year to
Yeah. Yeah.
commute back and forth, or the hours were quite long because of the journey times. And there was a lot of people working there who just didn't want to have to do that all the time, and so they wanted a place closer to home because they were just kind of struggling with the time allowances or not making as much money as they should have done. So it definitely played a part early on, trying to give people jobs locally. But also as time went on, I do think that when I think about the type of people I was trying to hire, I definitely leaned heavily towards people that didn't necessarily go to university, who I didn't really
Mm.
care about degrees or university or anything like that. And also, you can't do a degree in SEO, so it was a bit irrelevant. So, if someone had one, fine. But I got to the point where I didn't really, sounds terrible, I didn't really check CVs. Like, I read people's application forms, we asked them half a dozen questions on the form. I got more from that than reading someone's CV. So, most of the time, I didn't even check the CV, to be honest. I saw the
Yeah.
form. If I liked what I saw, got me in for an interview. And I definitely had a kind of a bias towards people who were self starters who maybe
Mm.
I wouldn't necessarily know that they were working class or middle class background, but I would definitely
Yeah.
look for people that had done side projects, who'd kind of done their own websites on the side or had set up Instagram channels on their own, like those kinds of things that show that they want to get up and do something with their lives rather than just get a job and it be a job. So I definitely lean towards that,
Yeah.
and try to give those kind of people a chance rather than the formal qualifications and the kind of the classic kind of Oxbridge kind of
Yeah.
academic subjects, math, science, English. I wasn't really keen on that at all.
Well, I suppose it kind of mirrors your journey, doesn't it? It's like
Mm.
there have been people that have taken the chance on you, and you kind of mirroring that throughout your career path. So, have you ever felt like, by the sounds of it, your working class, has never really held you back? Have you ever felt like that's ever been the case, or has there been anything that's kind of worked in your favour?
Yeah, I'll be completely honest. I can't. I say we never know for sure, but I don't think that my working class background and kind of my parents and family upbringing has really held me back. But also, I'm very aware that along with being from a working class background, I'm also a white male. So I know that
Mm.
the world, particularly the world of work, is conditioned to actually helped me, if anything. So I'm very, very aware of that. I've only become aware of that as I've gotten a little bit older and a bit more knowledgeable and spoken to a lot more people who don't have that privilege. So I think for me, that's probably balanced things out a little bit. So even though I have come from a working class background, yeah, being a white guy probably has helped me along the way and probably given me opportunities that
Yeah,
others who aren't like that and are from working class backgrounds haven't gotten, and I definitely have. So I'm aware of that, but I wouldn't say overall that I feel like I've been held back by my background. And like I said earlier, quite the opposite from my parents, really. They probably pushed me a bit more than they would have done normally.
yeah. So, in terms of the industry as a whole, well, what is kind of like the demographic generally?
Yeah, so it's interesting because within SEO, you've kind of got different kind of parts of it. So you do have kind of the more hardcore technical side. Then you've got kind of a content side and creative and kind of analytical and promotion, that kind of stuff. So there's lots of skill sets within it which can attract different demographics. So for example, it's not unusual for the more technical side to be what you'd expect in terms of being a bit more male dominated rather than female. But that has changed a lot, probably in the last
Mm,
5 or 6 years or so, where things have become a lot more kind of balanced there.
yeah,
And then you go towards content and digital PR kind of industries within SEO, and those are far more female led and definitely kind of tilted more towards females overall. So it is quite a big mix, to be honest. I think generally for an industry that overall is probably quite technical, it is probably more balanced than most, but it definitely hasn't always been like that. You know, I go back when I first got into it, it was definitely more a male dominated industry
yeah,
than balanced. And what we're seeing now is that's led to a lot of agencies. You know, you typically find most agencies are more led by males and females. Is starting to change slowly, but that's probably where the demographics are still quite heavily towards males. Is in the ownership and the kind of the senior levels of an agency. That still hasn't quite broken through yet. It is changing, but hasn't quite got
yeah,
there yet.
yeah. Because like within agencies and companies, like big companies, you've got this big push for like equality, diversity, and inclusion. Do you ever feel like it's still quite um, relevant in terms of? Do you feel like companies aren't just doing it just to tick the box? Do you feel like there's some genuine? Because I know in America, like they completely there's big companies just throwing it out the rule book, really.
Yeah, I think that there are companies in the UK that unfortunately will follow the US or use
Mm.
that as a bit of an excuse to maybe they might not do what some companies in the US are doing in terms of outwardly communicating, hey, we're stopping these programs or stopping these initiatives,
Yeah,
but they're more likely to just quietly forget about them. I think that, unfortunately, I think could happen. Because again, I think there are some very good companies out there, but there's also some not so good companies as well. And unfortunately, it's a bit easier just to kind of quietly forget about those initiatives and
yeah,
the fact that we should be trying harder to get more people from more diverse backgrounds into the
yeah,
industry. So I think it has made some forward steps. Like there's, for example, there's 3, 4, 5 companies, organisations now that I'm aware of that focus very heavily on getting people from working class, underprivileged, kind of minority backgrounds into the industry. Those
yeah,
weren't there 5, 6, 7 years ago, so it has gotten better. But unfortunately, I think there's still going to be those companies who just gloss over it and don't really make much of an effort. And
yeah,
unfortunately, the situation in the US won't be helping very much because it's a bit of a get out kind of for those people who don't really care about it.
yeah. Because I suppose it then puts pressure on those from working class backgrounds where they see there's companies not bothering, so they'll probably look at it and think, "Oh, why should I even bother trying because they're not even implementing?" And then you end up getting a disenfranchised generation, really. And I suppose, yeah, it just becomes a big struggle. And when you were working in the agency, like your own company, have you noticed the difference between like generations, like working?
I think that I'm only recently, because I think I'm getting a little bit older now. Like I've been in the industry for about 20 years now, and I'm
Yeah,
seeing the young people come through, and like Gen Z is a classic example, right? I probably don't want to get into that too much, but there are definitely different attitudes towards work, and I think that actually for me it's less about generations, but more about pre and post pandemic. I think that has definitely
Yeah.
triggered changes in the attitude towards work. And so, for example, you hear a lot of Gen Zs talking about how the opportunities are limited now to earn more money, to kind of earn and to have more kind of disposable income. So why should I bother? Why should I bother trying if they're not going to get the payoff for it? And I'm like, okay, I kind of get that. I can't argue too much with the fact that someone doesn't feel like they're getting what they deserve for working hard. So why should I bother? So I am starting to see that a little bit more now.
Yeah.
I don't agree with all of that, to be honest. But also I'm aware that things have changed over time, and there's like a new generation of people coming into the industry who just do things differently. And I think agencies have to adapt to that and just, I think, pick what they want to do and pick a lane. Really, do they want to adapt to that? Do they want to stay as they are and just keep going?
Yeah.
Like, I think they have to pick which way they want to go. But it's definitely changing, and it's hard for me to figure out. Okay, is this a big shift generally, or is
Yeah.
this just me getting old? Like, it's hard to know
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
which one it
Yeah.
is.
So do you feel like, because there is this kind of different attitude from Gen Z, I suppose, and like those from working class, they'll probably look at things very differently to what us growing up, and our views as working class are going to be very different now. Do you feel like companies need to kind of do some kind of like onboarding, or kind of integrate and kind of listen to, okay, what's your issues and how can we work together? Do you feel like companies need to do more of that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think they do, and I think again that's probably more of a thing since the pandemic, where a
Mm.
lot of people, it was definitely a thing before, but I think it's gotten worse, and that's because of remote working. So there's a lot of people who are now joining companies, professional companies, professional services, who have never visited the office, who have never visited a client or been in
Yeah.
a physical meeting room with a client. They've only ever done things over Zoom or Teams. And I do worry that that's kind of holding them back a little bit, and
Yeah.
that's leading to not probably a whole generation, but a large number of people who don't know how to conduct themselves in the office. Not that they're being stupid or silly, but they just don't know how to act around clients, how
So
to act during
office
meetings.
etiquette kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it probably is that kind of stuff. And I think that can hold people back. And I think going back to people from working class backgrounds who maybe their parents haven't worked in those environments either,
Mm.
they just don't know how to be, or what the etiquette is, or how to be professional. And
Yeah.
not because they're being unprofessional, but it means that companies have to be aware of that and account for the fact that, yeah, these people coming through don't really know how to do this or how to act. So they do need a bit more training, or a bit more help, because I think working at home and being in front of a Zoom screen all day
Yeah.
versus going into a client boardroom on the 20th floor of a skyscraper, like, those are very different
Yeah. Very, very
prospects. And I
different.
think
Yeah.
companies have to teach people how to approach those things, and just the little kind of things that shouldn't really matter but do matter, that they need to be aware of.
I watched one of your previous podcasts recently, and it talks about how you kind of left the agency, and it was down to kind of your mental health and well-being. Could you talk a little bit about that? And would you say that kind of could stem back to like your working class roots and how hard you would have worked and stuff like that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I left my agency about a year ago now, and that was because of mental health reasons, where I felt like it just all got a bit too much for me. So I was running, I had a co-founder, but I was the CEO. I was running most of the day-to-day of the company. We'd had a really hard couple of years where it felt like it was one step forwards, two step backwards, and just this relentless cycle of
Mm,
big challenges. And when you run a business, there's always challenges, there's always difficulties, but it felt like, oh, come on, give me a break. There was always more and more stuff
yeah.
going wrong than going right. And I think the compounding effect of that hit my mental health more than I realised.
Mm,
And then one day I just broke down and just said, I don't want to do this. I was hating my job, to be honest. I wasn't really enjoying it at all.
mm,
And realised that at first I thought I needed a break and thought I'd take a few weeks out and then go again and be okay. But when I did step away and took a few days off, I started to realise that actually I'm really not okay.
mm,
And my headspace, my mental health was completely shot. and I needed to actually have a complete change, which was to
Yeah.
leave my own company, which was unthinkable. But now I had to think about that because it felt like I had to do that. So yeah, that's kind of how things ended there. And I think the mental health side of things, and growing up in a working class background, my mum and dad, you never spoke about mental health. It was that
Yeah.
generation in particular where you just got on with it and you kind of just cracked on, and things get hard and you just keep going. And
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that did come through to me and kind of come through
Mm.
to how I thought and how I acted, in my agency. But there was definitely the idea that you just keep going and you keep working hard, and if you keep working hard and keep going, it will pay off for you. So maybe that was influenced by that background a little bit, because that's what they did. They just kept working. Yeah, my
Yeah.
mum had at times 2 or 3 jobs and just kept going, and was raising a couple of kids, and my dad was working nights all the time. All these things. You just cracked on with it. That's what you did. So
Mm.
some of that probably did rub off on me, and meant that maybe I didn't take my own mental health as serious as I should have done, and realised that there comes a point where the answer isn't to just keep going; it's to take a step away and actually look after
Yeah.
yourself a bit better.
Yeah. No, I think it is really important because, like for me, for instance, it wasn't until because I used to work in ad agency,
Mm.
and it wasn't until I'd left um, that I realised how stressed I actually was.
Yeah,
So I think sometimes you do have to take that step back, and then you kind of look at the bigger picture, and you're like, oh shit, maybe I need to look at myself and think, okay, well, reevaluate the process. So I think, especially coming from working class roots, because I always remember working in the industry, I'll be doing the late nights, but it is that kind of mental work ethic of the working class. It stems back like my mum, she would be working all the hours in the day just to
mm.
provide, and it's like growing up, you see that, and you're like, okay, I must work hard. I've got to persevere. But then
Yeah,
ultimately, it's at detriment to yourself, isn't it? So you then have to
yeah.
take that step back and analyze. Okay, this is what I need to do. But yeah, I think it does ring true with a lot of people from working class. From whenever I've done these interviews, it's
Mm.
a similar story where they'll put all the hours in to prove themselves, but then there's others that they've worked with who don't have to because they know the system and the way it is,
Yeah,
which is a
and
shame.
again, that's where their privilege, I guess, comes in, and
Yeah.
they're not aware of it, which isn't their fault. It's just how they've experienced the world.
Mm.
And yeah, you're right. Now I think about it, I got my first job. I mean, wasn't an official job when I was 11,
Yeah.
working in the shop that my mum worked in, and it was like, I'll just do a few hours here and there, and
Yeah.
like so even from a very young age, I was taught that you work and you work hard,
Mm.
and then you get your money, then you do what you want with it, and that's how the world works. And yeah, I've never really thought too much about how that's affected me later in life, but there is definitely that work ethic that I know for a fact comes from my mom and dad.
Mm.
um, and yeah, that's a good thing generally, but can also be a bad thing where, yeah, for me at my agency, I think I definitely got to the point where I just thought, just keep going, keep working, and just it wasn't necessarily the hours as such that I was putting, but more so just the idea of if you just keep doing this, it will eventually work out and it
Yeah.
will come good, and that's not always the case.
Yeah. In terms of because like our education growing up and like for yourself, you went on to study um, law and then you fall into SEO. Do you feel like education as a whole is kind of catering for like the working class to go into the world of work? Do you feel like traditional education should kind of be looked at?
Yeah, I could probably spend hours talking about just that. I think that it feels like education is more optimized for the outcome of the outputs of the school, and the kind of things
Mm.
like league tables and score and kind of the Ofsted markings of the school, which are important. There needs to be standards in education, but I do worry that looking back at the school that we went to and kind of how things are generally, that people aren't being set up for actual success in the workplace. They're being set up to pass exams, and
Yeah.
as you've probably seen yourself, like there's only so far those exams and qualifications have now helped me in my career. Like, there's definitely bits that have, and
Yeah.
probably bits I'm not aware of that have. But generally, it feels like they're optimizing for those results and those outcomes, which make the school look good, as opposed to what the person actually wants from their life and their career. And there was elements of it where you got career fairs and you kind of got sent off to see different
Mm.
employers and things like that. But I definitely think there's a lot that could be done better with working class backgrounds and working class kids who
Yeah.
don't really know what's possible and don't really know what they can do with their lives, particularly with creative, because
Yeah.
it's still math, science, English, right? It's not kind of arts and performance and theatre and music. Like those things, even now, I think are still seen as secondary topics as opposed to core topics that you should learn about.
Yeah. So because you're doing like consultancy work, so you're working alongside agencies, you're giving them
Mm.
advice, and are you seeing any kind of changes, and are you seeing them kind of like taking on board? Okay, there's a certain group of people, there's a demographic that we're not really reaching out. Are you seeing stuff changing there?
Yeah, it's actually something that comes up not loads, but it's definitely more prevalent than it used to be. So, for example, one of the agencies I work with, I think maybe about 4 or 5 months ago now, they asked me a question about the diversity of their team. They realised
Mm.
that actually they were very good in terms of male female diversity, but less in terms of people from buying backgrounds, those kinds of things, where it was kind of obvious they weren't going to those kind of areas and trying to recruit more people who
Yeah.
were from those non-white backgrounds and non-white kind of areas of the country, that kind of stuff. And they wanted to know, well, what can we do better here and stuff like that. And I think it's a long process. You can't just obviously flick a switch and
Yeah.
change that overnight. But I'm seeing more companies being more aware of that. But
Mm.
also, there is a bit of a bias here because I want to work with companies that have that kind of approach and want to do good in the world, not just rinse it for all they can get. So I think for me, I do see it a bit more, but I'm under no illusions that the industry as a whole has a bit of work to do on that front and kind of needs to be more diverse generally. But some companies that I work with are definitely trying harder than they may have done in the past.
Yeah. I suppose I think working class covers such a wide range. I suppose it's quite difficult for companies to try and, I wouldn't say pigeonhole, but kind of say, okay, this is a demographic that we need to look at. And it always feels like it's the kind of forgotten group of all the
Yeah.
different groups out there. So, based on like you working in the industry, having your own agency, and now consulting, do you feel like there's anything that could kind of happen, or there could be something in place that companies could do?
I think it, like, when it happened with my agency, as we spoke about earlier, it was more kind of a reflection of my background that I was then
Mm.
projecting on the company that allowed that kind of mindset where we weren't deliberately saying we're going to try and recruit working class people or
Yeah.
anything like that, but it definitely did happen that way. Um, I think that for a lot of founders of companies, that may not happen if that's not their background. But as you said, working class as a demographic, as a segment of society, I still don't think it's explicitly targeted by a lot of companies in my industry, because I think there's been a big movement and shift towards gender diversity
Yeah.
and that kind of thing, which has started to get a lot better. Um, Another example would be kind of people with disabilities. I think that's another kind of not completely forgotten, but another demographic that isn't probably as looked at as it should be in terms of getting more people into the workforce, into the
Yeah.
creative industry. So I think there are definitely some forgotten groups and kind of minorities out there. So I think working class is probably not completely forgotten about, but definitely it's not top of the agenda. It's not one that people think about as much as they probably should. So there can definitely be improvements there. But I think it starts with that awareness of it, no matter
Yeah.
which some kind of segment or demographic it is. It starts with the awareness of it, I think, rather than anything else, or the founder
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, because sometimes, based on my experience and speaking to some of the guests, whenever they've worked in companies, it's always been a case of who you know, and it's people that they see, that they recognise and feel comfortable around. And I suppose, do you feel like it's going to kind of be like that for for the foreseeable, or do you think it will change?
I think it is changing, but it definitely feels slower than it probably should be. And I think it's because of that idea of unconscious biases are so
Mm,
strong, and
yeah.
one of the most impactful things I ever read about once was actually it was a book by a guy called David Goggins, who generally, I don't think he's quite a big influencer now as well, but years ago I read his book, and he was a black guy, and he talked about the idea that there'd be times when in a business setting he'll be the only black guy in the room, and he challenged the reader to be like, imagine you are the only X in the room, so it could be
Mm,
female, could be black woman, black man, something like that. And it kind of hit me that I don't think I've ever felt like I was the only white guy in the room or the
mm,
only man in the room. And that really helped me. This is probably going back 7 or 8 years now, to really think about the fact that, people who look and kind of sound like me, it's not necessarily the best idea to only
yeah.
recruit those kind of people. That actually I should look further than that, and it should be kind of more diverse. And the idea that I've never had that feeling of being the only man in the room or the only white guy in the room, or never really noticed it. But there's so many people out there who don't know about those biases and know that that's a thing that you should try and
Mm,
consider. And the idea that, if actually in my industry, conferences used to be quite white male dominated, and the idea that if you are a black woman sat in the crowd looking up at a stage full of white guys, you're not going to think you can ever get there, right?
yeah.
That understanding, I think, takes a lot of time to for people to learn and to actually realise. And thankfully, I've been through kind of experiences and processes. I've been able to understand those things more. But I think it's still a hell of a lot of people who don't, and don't have that exposure to people that are prepared to tell them that and give them that perspective. So I think it will be a thing that unfortunately sticks around for a lot longer than we'd like,
Yeah.
but it is definitely getting better, but slowly rather than quickly.
Yeah. No, it's a very valid point. If you see on the stage a group of people that doesn't look like you or sound like
Mm.
you, then you're going to think to yourself, why should I even bother to try and reach those highs? So, yeah, I think it is still there. Was there anything else that you wanted to highlight? Is there any advice you'd give? Because it sounds like throughout your career, well, since you're 11, you've always been working and you're kind of doing your own thing. Is there any advice you would give, or any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think that generally, I feel like if you're trying to build a career, which, dial all of this back, I think a lot of people, from whether you're working class background or not, they want to do something with their lives. They want to build something, and I think that a key thing to try and think about is, when you're entering the workplace, how to really show that you want a career, not just a job. And I think
Mm,
that, again, if you're from a working class background, you may have been taught that a job is a job. Just get a job, any job, and as long as it pays you well and you don't hate it, then you're fine. As opposed to thinking, what career do you want? And you may make some mistakes or get some jobs you don't love along the way, but I think the focus should always be, what career am I trying to build, and
mm,
what is it I want in the long term? And then trying to get the jobs that kind of allow you to go along that process and build the career that you want. But also, it's fine to change careers if you want to. I think if you
yeah.
can do it after 5, 6, 10 years, that's also fine as well. But I think that the overarching piece of advice would be, try and think of it as a career, not just a job which you need
Mm,
to get and then keep, and that's it, and or jump from job to job to job. It's more about the overarching career that you're trying to build. I think heavily about that, and try and communicate that to people who you want to hire you. Because for me, as an employer, someone who thinks like that and can communicate that's what they care about, immediately that stands out to me.
yeah. Because I suppose as well that, like you just said, you might change career further down the line, but you'll have transferable skills which you would have learned throughout. So,
Yeah,
especially now with the likes of AI and stuff like that. So, I think if you have changed jobs throughout your life, I think you've gained knowledge and transferable skills that will kind of help you further down the line. And I guess it's kind of being adaptable and just looking at it like that.
yeah, exactly. And AI is a great example of that right now, where if you're not even trying to adapt to that and thinking, well, how does this affect me in my current job and my career? Then if you do get through it, it's pure luck. So you need to actually be thinking about it and thinking about how can I adapt to this and make my next step kind of part of what's going on and part of the trends, not going against it too much. So, and again, that's okay. That's how you need to think about this. You need to think about how I can kind of shift to adapt my jobs towards the career that I want, but also your career may change based on what's going on around you as well.
No, it's cool. Yeah, thanks for that. It was really good insight, and like, there was a lot of good piece of information that you talked about there. Is there any are you on any socials, or is there any way people could get in touch? What's the best way to reach
Yeah,
out?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so you can search for Paddy Moogan. I don't think there's too many of us with that name. And also my website at the minute is called thenewleader.digital as well, which is where all of my leadership and management advice goes. And I have like a newsletter as well. So yeah, LinkedIn or thenewleader.digital.
Okay. Thanks again, especially on the mental health stuff. I think people need to talk a little bit more about it and be open and frank and stuff. So yeah,
Yeah,
no,
definitely.
thanks for doing the interview, and it's much appreciated. And yeah, hopefully people get a lot from this.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, thanks for having me as well.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Initial Step. If you resonate with the stories we share and have a similar background you'd like to talk about, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch and maybe you'll be featured in an upcoming episode. And don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Be sure to check out our previous episodes for more inspiring stories. Until next time, we'll see you on the next one.